For those of you that smoke or have smoked, very familiar with the scent of a match that's just been struck. The smell of sulfur dioxide. Very pungent smell. One of those smells that stay imprinted in your memory for a long time. This story comes to you from a friend of mine years ago who lived in a small town. Family lived in a smaller house with a little bit of property, had a nice yard, and about 100 yards down there was a very wooded area with a little creek running through it. For the sake of anonymity, we're going to call her Sarah. So Sarah lived for a few years in that home. One of her few trips to the city, she had met up with some friends and took up smoking. So on one particular visit, when she came back home, brought a few packs of cigarettes in her purse. She got inside and hid him in her room from the parents, and she had another smaller brother, sister. So once in a while, Sarah would go out in the evening when everyone was asleep, and she'd take a quick walk towards the creek, and she'd have a cigarette. She'd be by herself. Spent a lot of time out there. So on her way back, she would often hear these odd noises coming from those woods and just put that off to wildlife or just the wind, the leaves, nature. So she never said anything to anyone, obviously, because she didn't want her parents and family to know she was smoking. So one night, she's doing the dishes, and there's a small window there just above the sink, and she could hear a little rustling of the leaves. This was late summer, beginning fall. And she would look outside, and just a little bit of swaying in the wind, she would see the leaves on the trees. Nothing unusual. So she's washing the dishes, and then something piqued her curiosity. She looks out the window, and there's a little red orangey light that's flickering. She thought that was kind of odd. So she hurried up quick, finished the dishes, went up to her room, took a cigarette out of the pack, grabbed a couple of matches, and made her way out the back door. Her parents were inside watching television, and her brother and sister were playing. So out she went, and as she's walking out, she doesn't see that little orangey, reddish light flickering around. From a distance, it had looked like a small Christmas light. So she's walking around, and when she was safe enough, she lit up her cigarette. And as she did so, she felt a chill come over her, and she looked around quickly. She felt like someone was standing behind her, but of course she looked and there was no one there. So she continued going forward, walking towards the creek, went past the woods. As she stood there and the moon was out, and she had her cigarette, it was a little windy, but she could smell a match being struck not far away from her. So she looked around and she started calling out to see if anyone was around, Perhaps she had company that night. But of course, no one answered. So she finished her cigarette, quickly walked back to the house. Her mom was waiting near the door and said, "Where you been?" And she said, "I just went down for a quick walk for some fresh air." And her mom said, "Is something burning?" And she goes, "No." She got very nervous. She figured her mom could smell the cigarette smoke on her. So she said no and kind of lingered around outside for a bit. And finally, when her mom went back inside, she went right up to her room. So when it came time for her to go to sleep, she was just about to drift off into sleep, and suddenly she was awakened. And she sat up in bed and looked around her room, and her window was slightly open, so a bit of breeze was coming through and swaying the curtain slightly. So she got up, and she's standing there looking out the window, and way out in the distance she sees a little red and orange colored light flickering, what looked like a cigarette ember. She got very scared, closed the window, went back to bed, and just started to think about what that might be, and she's pretty sure, she's convinced that there's someone else out there smoking. So, goes back to sleep. A few days had gone by, nothing strange was happening. And then, again, she's cleaning up after the meal and standing there at the sink, and again she looks out the window and sees that little bright ember glowing in the distance. So she stops the faucet from running, wipes her hands, goes out the door and starts running towards the woods. At that instant, her mom comes running and goes, Where are you going?" She says, "I have to check on something." She goes, "I think there's somebody out here." And her mom said, "Well, you're crazy. Come back here before you get hurt. God knows what's waiting out there." So of course her dad got up, put his jacket on, and just followed right after her. So he's given chase after her. She's running towards the creek. And she gets there, and of course there's nobody there. And her father catches up to her and says, "What's wrong with you? What are you doing out here? Shouldn't you be inside?" And she said, "Dad, I think there's somebody out here." He said, "Well, yeah, that's possible. We're not far from one of the roads back here." She goes, "No." She goes, "I've seen somebody smoking." And her father says, "Well, how would you know that? You're so far from the house." She goes, "Well, I've noticed a few times when I've been doing dishes, I've noticed a lit cigarette kind of moving around, like way back near the woods there." He says, "Well, that could be anything. That could be brake lights from a car." She goes, "No, these aren't brake lights." So they both headed back towards the home. As they're walking towards the home, suddenly the father stopped and said, "Do you smell that?" And she goes, "What?" She goes, "Someone just lit a match." And she says, "Oh yeah?" And the father turns around, he says, "There's someone smoking around here." He says, "Someone just lit a match. I can smell that sulfur dioxide smell." So the father told her to go back home, and he walked around the property a little bit. And he came back, and of course he said he found nothing, and nobody was out there. So that was kind of odd. And the good thing was that Sarah had also experienced this, so she didn't feel like she was alone or losing her mind in all this. So a few weeks went by and nothing happened out of the ordinary. But then one night, Sarah was getting ready for bed up in her room, and suddenly she got drawn to the window. And there, standing below her window, is a dark figure with a cigarette in hand. She starts to scream, and her mom comes running into the room, and she brings her over to the window. She said, "Mom, is someone standing outside there having a cigarette?" Of course, the mother looks out and there's nobody there. She says, well, maybe they ran away. So they both went down. Father came down also. They went out the back door. They're walking around the property. They got their flashlights. And of course, they don't see anybody. But one thing they all agreed on was they could smell a match that had just been struck. Now, all three of them had experienced the same thing, except Sarah was the only one that actually saw something. So, thinking there might be a practical joke, or might be just somebody had walked onto the property for a cigarette, or just someone maybe that was trying to get Sarah's attention. After a few days, Sarah's father and mother decided that maybe they should send her off to her aunt's house, which is probably about 2 hours away. Just for a little while, they said. So they sent Sarah off. She settled into her aunt's place. She had been there a few times before and was familiar with the home and the property. Her aunt had a small 2-bedroom home, 1 level, with a little bit of property in the back, some trees. So Sarah spent a few weeks there. Nothing unusual happened until a few days before she was to come back home. Now, apparently, she had kept in touch with her parents throughout all of this by phone, and her parents told her that they hadn't seen or heard or even smelt anything weird since she had left. So, Sarah's mother took some salt and poured it in a straight line across all the entrances of the home, across the door thresholds. She had a feeling that they were dealing with something supernatural. It had been almost 2 weeks since Sarah had a cigarette. She had left them at home and did not bring them with her. Her aunt didn't smoke and she didn't want to let on anything. Didn't want it to get back to her parents. They would be very upset with her. So the night before she's to leave the home, she has a strange dream. She said that there was a dark figure that kept stalking her. It was walking around with a cigarette, but it wasn't lit. She couldn't make out a face or anything, but said that this entity or this figure, she felt an evil vibe from it. So anyway, she woke up and got up to get a glass of water. And on her way back to bed, she stopped at the window. She looked outside and she saw a red light, like a cigarette ember burning. And she freaked out. She felt paralyzed. She regained her composure quickly, went into her aunt's room, woke her up, and asked her if there was anyone else on the property, and her aunt said no. She goes, I think there's someone out there. And her aunt says, there's no one out there. There hasn't been anyone out there for so long. She goes, I'm here by myself. I've been here for so long. She goes, well, maybe somebody just trespassing. So her aunt got up. They both walked out the door. They looked around. They called out. They saw nothing. So they came back inside and were deciding whether they should call the police or not. Perhaps somebody was prowling around the properties and looking to do harm. So then Sarah opened up to her about what was happening. She said, no, I'm aware your mom did tell me that you were experiencing these things. And Sarah told her about this dream. And then her aunt suddenly remembered that years ago, there used to be a family friend of her father's that was a heavy smoker who ended up passing away. He never had come by for a long time. They found out about it through some other friends that he had passed. Sarah was trying to connect the dots to see if that had to do with any of her experiences the last little while. So she decided to spend the evening with her aunt. So the next day came and father came to pick her up. Everything was fine. And then somewhere along the ride, her father turned to her and asked, "Have you been smoking?" And Sarah just sat there and couldn't look him in the eye and kept looking out the window of the car. And she said, "Why do you say that?" He goes, "I'm just asking you if you've been smoking lately." And she didn't want to lie to him, so she turned to him and said, "Yes, I have." She goes, "I've got a couple of packs that are hidden in my room, and every once in a while I'll sneak out for a smoke." And she asked her father, said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I had the strangest dream the other night." He said, "You remember so-and-so that used to come out and hang at the house, and hadn't seen him for a long time. He had passed away." He said, "I completely forgot about him up until last night. I had a dream. And in that dream, he came up to me and he was asking me if I could light a cigarette for him. And you know, I don't smoke. But in the dream, he said to him, 'Well, I know someone that does.'" So her father woke up and was all confused and wondered why that had happened. And so he's sharing this with her, and he's wondering if there's some weird paranormal stuff going on now with this guy's ghost and his daughter. So anyway, they get home and they keep the story to themselves. They didn't share it with the mother. So a couple of nights had gone by and things were normal. But about a week later, Sarah was standing at the same kitchen sink doing the dishes. And she thought she heard a knock on the door. And she actually did, because her father called out and said, "Hey, someone's at the door, see who it is." So Sarah stopped doing the dishes, dried her hands, walks over to the door, opens the door up, and there's no one standing there. There's no one at the door. She turns around to her father and says, "Dad, there's no one here at the door." And as she's saying that, her father starts walking towards her with his eyes wide open and his mouth open in shock. And he says, "Close that door quickly." She goes, What's going on?" And she turns around, and there's this dark figure standing at the door and says to her, "Got a light?"